Socrates, having said these things, Cebes replying said, Socrates, it seems to me the other things were well said, but the things about the soul cause much unbelief in people, since when it is released from the body, it may no longer be anywhere. But on that day the person dies, it is destroyed and lost. Immediately running away from the body and going out, it is scattered like breath or smoke to depart vanishing, and it would no longer be anywhere. Since, if it were gathered together anywhere by itself and released from these evils which you now described, there would be much hope and beauty, Socrates, that it is true what you say. But perhaps this requires not a little reassurance and faith, how the soul of a dead person has any ability and wisdom. You say the truth, Cebes, said Socrates, but what shall we do? Do you wish to communicate with words about these things, whether this is probably so or not? I do, said Cebes. I would like to hear what opinions you have about these things. Then I don't think, said Socrates, if anyone heard us now, not even if one were a comic poet, would one say that I am chattering and making arguments about things not relevant. So, if you like, it should be examined thoroughly. And let us consider it in this way, whether the souls of people who died are in Hades or not. Thus there is an ancient argument which we remember, that those arriving there are from here, and again they come back and are born from the dead. And if this is so, the living being born again from the dying, certainly our souls would be there, for they would not be born again if they did not exist. And this would be a sufficient indication of this, if in reality it should become clear that the living are born nowhere else than from the dead. But if this is not so, another argument would be needed. Certainly, said Cebes. Now, if you wish to learn easily, consider this not only in regard to people, but also in regard to all animals and plants, and in short, to whatever has birth. Let us see about all, just as all things are generated, whether opposites are generated out of their opposites. When there happens to be such, beauty opposite to the ugly and justice to injustice, and countless others having them. Then let us consider whether it is necessary for whatever has an opposite to be generated from anything else but itself or out of its opposite. And when anything becomes greater, by necessity was it out of the smaller that it became greater? Yes. So then, if it becomes smaller, was it out of the greater that later it became smaller? It is so, he said. And out of the stronger the weaker, and out of the slower the faster? Certainly. But what? Does not something worse come out of the better, and the just out of the unjust? Of course. Then, he said, have we taken this far enough that everything is generated so, the opposite circumstances out of the opposites? Certainly. But what then? Is there also such in themselves between all these pairs of opposites two kinds of generation, from one over to the other, and from the other back over to the first? Between a larger thing and a smaller is augmentation and decline. And do we call one increase and the other decrease? Yes, he said. Then also dividing and combining, and cooling and heating, and all similarly, even if now and then we do not use names. But in action, anyway, everywhere, is it necessarily so that the same things born are generated both out of each other and out of each into the other? Certainly. What then, he said, is there an opposite to life, just as sleeping is to waking? Certainly, he said. What? Death, he said. Then are these generated out of each other, if really opposites exist? And are not there two origins between the two of them? Of course. Now I shall tell you about one of the pairs of which I just now told you, said Socrates, both it and the origins, and you tell me about the other. And I mean sleeping and waking, and out of sleeping is generated waking, and out of waking is generated sleeping, and their origins are falling asleep and waking up. Is it far enough for you, he said, or not? Certainly. Now you also tell me, he said, this about life and death. Do you not say that living is the opposite of being dead? I do. And are they generated out of each other? Yes. Then what is generated out of the living? The dead, he said. And what out of the dead? It is necessary, he said, to agree that it is the living. Out of the dead, then, Cebes, living things and living beings are born. It appears so, he said. Then our souls, he said, exist in Hades. It seems likely. Then also concerning these origins, does one happen to be definite? For surely dying is definite, is it not? Certainly, he said. So what shall we do? Shall we deny the opposite of birth, and in this will nature be lame? Or is it necessary to restore to dying an opposite origin? Certainly, he said. What is it? Coming back to life. Then if it really is coming back to life, would birth into the living out of the dead be coming back to life? Certainly. Then for us to agree also in this, that the living are born out of the dead, no less than the dead out of the living. And this being the case, it seems to me to be proof that it is necessary for the souls to be somewhere, from where they are born again. It seems to me, Socrates, he said, this is necessarily so from the agreements. And so now, Cebes, he said, we were not wrong in agreeing, as it seems to me, for if generating did not always give back some to the others, going around like in a circle, but the origin out of one alone would go straight into the direct opposite, and not bending back again to the other, nor making a circle. Then do you think all things would end up the same form, and would have also the same experience if the experiences also would stop generating? What do you mean, he said. It is not hard to understand what I mean. For example, if falling asleep existed and waking up did not give back being generated out of falling asleep, you know that all things would end up showing Endymion silly and nowhere. It would appear because everything also would be experiencing the same state, sleeping. Or if all things were combined and not divided, quickly it would become Anaxagoras' all things together. And the same way, dear Cebes, if everything would die, which should receive life, when they should die, the dead remaining in this form and not coming back to life, then is it not very necessary to end up with everything dying and nothing living? For if out of the others the living should be born, and the living should die, is there any device by which all would not be used up in dying? None, it seems to me, Socrates, said Cebes, but you seem to me to speak the absolute truth. For it is, Cebes, he said, as it seems to me, absolutely so, and we are not deceived in these agreements, but it is in reality that the living both come back to life and are born out of the dead, and that the souls of the dead exist. And besides, said Cebes, replying, according to that argument, Socrates, if it is true, which you often like to say, that for us learning is nothing else than being happening to recall. And according to this, it is necessary for us in some previous time to have learned what now we remember. But this is impossible if our soul did not exist somewhere before being born in the human form. So also in this, the soul is likely to be immortal. But Cebes, said Simmias, replying, what were the demonstrations of this? Remind me, for I'm not sure I recall at present. In a word, said Cebes, a most beautiful one is that people being questioned, if one asks well, they say everything themselves which is needed, and yet if knowledge and correct reason did not happen within them, they could not do this. Secondly, if one leads them to a diagram or any other such thing, from there it is proved most clearly that this is so. And if you are not persuaded by this, Simmias, said Socrates, see if it seems so to you, looking at it in this way. For do you not disbelieve that what is called learning is recalling? Disbelieve you I do not, said Simmias, but this same thing I need to learn is what the argument is about, recalling. And almost from what Cebes endeavored to say, already I am recalling and being persuaded. Nevertheless, I should like to hear now what you were endeavoring to say. I would say this, For surely we agree, if anyone recalls anything, he must know it at some previous time. Certainly, he said. Then also do we agree on this, that when knowledge comes in such a way, is it recalling? But I mean some way like this. If someone, having seen or heard, or in some other way perceived something received, knows not that alone, but also another awareness, the knowledge of which is not the same, but something else, then are we not correct in saying that he recalls that which the awareness received? What do you mean? For example, different is knowledge of a person and of a lyre. Of course. Then do you know that lovers, when they see a lyre or garment or something else which their favorites like to use, they experience this, aware of the lyre, and in the intuition receiving the form of the favorite, whose lyre it was. And this is recalling. Just as someone seeing Simmias may often recall Cebes, and there would be countless other such examples. Yes, countless, by Zeus, said Simmias. Then is this kind of thing recalling, especially when this is experienced about those things which through time are not examined and already forgotten? Certainly, he said. But what? Does one seeing a drawing of a horse and a drawing of a lyre recall a person? And seeing a drawing of Simmias recall Cebes? Certainly. Then also seeing a drawing of Simmias, does he recall Simmias himself? Of course, he said. Then, according to all these things, does it not result that recalling is from similar things? And it is from dissimilar things. It does result. But when one remembers something from similar things, then is it not necessarily a special feeling to understand whether this left a perfect similarity of what is recalled or not that? Necessarily, he said. Now consider if this is so. We say there is such a thing as equality. I do not mean a stick to a stick, nor a stone to a stone, nor any such things, but beyond these, something completely different, equality itself. Shall we say it exists or not? Yet we shall say so, by Zeus, said Simmias, emphatically. And do we know what it is? Certainly. From where did we receive knowledge of it? Was it not from what we just said? Was it not from seeing equal sticks or stones or other things? From these we understand that which is different from these, or does it not appear different to you? And consider this. Then do not the same stones and sticks sometimes appear equal in one way but not in another? Certainly. But what? Did the equals themselves ever appear to you unequal, or inequality? Never, Socrates. Then these equals and equality itself are not the same. It does not appear so to me at all, Socrates. But from these equals, he said, which are different from that equality, did you nevertheless understand and receive knowledge of it? Most true, he said. Then it is either similar to them or dissimilar. Certainly. But it makes no difference. Whenever seeing one thing from this vision you understand another, whether similar or dissimilar, it would necessarily be, he said, recalling it. Certainly. But what? Do we experience this concerning the sticks and things which we just now said were equal? Then does it appear to us they are equal, as that which is equality itself? Do they lack something from being like equality or not? And they are lacking much, he said. Then do we agree that when anyone seeing anything thinks, this which I now see wishes to be like something else, and it is unable to be like that, but is inferior? Must one necessarily think that comes from previous knowledge which one says it resembles but has a deficiency? Necessarily. Then what? And did we experience this or not, in regard to the equals and equality itself? Absolutely. Then it is necessary for us to foreknow equality before that time when first seeing equal things, we thought that all these things are reaching to be like equality, but have a deficiency. That is so. But we agree also that not from another is it understood, nor is it possible to be understood, but either from seeing or teaching or from some other sense. And I mean they are all the same. For that is so, Socrates. to whoever wishes to clarify the argument. But from the senses, one must understand that all sense objects reach for that which is equality, and are deficient of it. Is this what we say? Yes. Then before we began to see and hear and use the other senses, we must somewhere have received knowledge of that which is equality itself. If we compared it with the equals, we understand from the senses that all things want to be like that, but are inferior to it. It is necessary from what was said before, Socrates. Then being born immediately did we see and hear and have the other senses? Certainly. But do we say before having these it was necessary to receive knowledge of equality? Yes. Then before being born, since it seems likely, it was necessary for us to receive this. It seems likely. Then if having received it before being born, we were born having it, did we know before being born and upon being born not only equality and the greater and lesser, but also such abstractions? For our current argument is no more about equality than about beauty itself, and goodness itself, and justice and holiness, and as I say, about everything which we recognize as that which is, both in the questioning inquiry and in choosing answers. So it is necessary for us to have received knowledge before being born. That is so. And if having received it we did not forget it each time, one always is born knowing and knows throughout life. For knowing is this, having received knowledge and not losing it. Do we not say this forgetting, Simmias, is throwing away knowledge? Certainly, Socrates, he said. But I think, if having received it before being born, we should lose it when born, but later, by using the senses concerning those things, we regain that knowledge, which we also had before then. Then would not what we call learning not be regaining the relative knowledge? Certainly. For this appears possible, perceiving something, either seeing or hearing or receiving it by some other sense, to understand from this something different, which had been forgotten, with which this was associated, whether dissimilar or similar. So that, as I say, there are two alternatives. Either we are born knowing these things, and know them through all of life, or later what we say is learning is nothing but remembering these things, and learning would be recalling. And that is quite so, Socrates. Then which do you choose, Simmias? Were we born knowing, or do we remember later the knowledge we received before? I have no choice at present, Socrates. But what about this? You can choose, and in any way it seems to you about it. Could a knowing man give an account about what he knows or not? It is quite necessary, Socrates, he said. And does it seem to you everyone can give an account about these things, which we were just now discussing? I would wish it, said Simmias, but I am rather afraid that tomorrow at this time there will no longer be any person who could do so properly. Then does it not seem to you, Simmias, that everyone knows these things? By no means. Then they remember whatever they learned, necessarily. When did our souls receive knowledge of them? For it was not after being born as humans, definitely not. Then previously, yes. Then, Simmias, souls exist previously, before they were born in human form, without bodies, and they had wisdom. Unless we receive this knowledge when born, Socrates, for this time still remains. Well, my friend, but at what other time do we lose them? For we are not born having them, as we just agreed. Do we lose them at this time in which we also receive them? Or do you have some other time to suggest? Not at all, Socrates. But I fooled myself, saying nothing. Then is this how it is for us, Simmias? If there exists what we are always repeating, beauty and goodness and every such essence, and we refer all things from the senses to this, our being already existing before discovering them, and we compare these with that, necessarily this just as these also exist, and thus our soul also exists before we were born. And if these do not exist, would the argument thus be saying otherwise? Then is it so? And is it equally necessary these things exist, and our souls also did before we were born? And if these do not, neither do they. Marvelously, Socrates, said Simmias. It seems to me to be the same necessity, and beautifully the argument has recourse to our soul existing before we were born, just as the essence does also which you mention. For nothing is so plain to me as this, that all such things most definitely exist, beauty and goodness, and all the others which you just now mentioned, and it seems to me it is sufficiently proven. But what about Cebes, said Socrates, for Cebes must also be persuaded. He is sufficiently, said Simmias, as I think, and yet he is the staunchest human in disbelieving arguments. But I think this has not failed to persuade him, that before we were born our soul existed. However, whether also when we die it still exists, it does not seem proven to him nor to me, Socrates. But still the concern of the many remains, which Cebes just now mentioned, how the soul of the dying person is dispersed, and this is the end of its existence. For what prevents it from being born and brought together from somewhere else and existing before coming into a human body, but when it has come and left this, from at that time both ending itself and being destroyed? You speak well, Simmias, said Cebes, for it appears as though half of what is needed is proven, that before we are born our soul existed. But it is necessary to prove besides that also when we die it will exist, no less than before being born, if the proof is to be complete. It has been proven, Simmias and Cebes, said Socrates, even now, if you are willing to combine this argument with the one which we agreed upon before, that everything living is born out of the dead. For if the soul exists also previously, then necessarily when it comes into life and is born, it is born from nothing else than the dead and the dying. Then is it not necessary also for the dying to exist, since it must be born again? Thus is proved even now what you mentioned. And yet you and Simmias seem to be glad to examine this argument even more thoroughly, and you are afraid, like children, that truly when it steps out of the body the wind may blow and disperse it, especially if one chances to die, not in calm weather, but in a great storm. And Cebes, laughing, said, As though afraid, Socrates, try to persuade us, but rather not as though we are afraid, but perhaps there is a child within us who fears such things. Therefore let us try to persuade him not to be afraid of death, as if it were a hobgoblin. But, said Socrates, you should chant to him every day until you charm it away. Then where, Socrates, he said, shall we find such a good chanter, since you are leaving us? Greece is large, Cebes, he said, in which there are many good men, and there are many also from foreign peoples, all of whom you should search through seeking such a chanter, sparing neither money nor labor, since there is nothing more necessary on which you could spend your money. But you should also seek yourselves with each other. Perhaps you would not easily find any better able to do this than you. But that will be done, said Cebes. But let us return to where we left off, if it is pleasing to you. Truly pleasing, of course it is. You speak beautifully, he said. Then must we ask ourselves, said Socrates, something such as what kind of a thing then is liable to suffer this experience, the dispersing, and for what kind of thing is this experience to be feared, and for what kind of thing is it not? And after this next to consider which the soul is, and out of these to be encouraged, or to be afraid on behalf of our soul. You say the truth, he said. So then is not that which is combined and compounded naturally liable to suffer this, being divided in the same way as it is compounded? And if something chances which is uncompounded, in this alone is it liable not to suffer these things, if really it is different. It seems to be so to me, said Cebes. Then what is always constant and the same way, these things very probably are uncompounded, and what is changing and never constant are these compounded. It seems so to me. Let us turn, he said, to what was said in the early argument. Is the essence itself to which we give the meaning being, both in questioning and answering, the same way always constant or changing? Equality itself, beauty itself, each entity which is really, do they ever show any change whatsoever? Or is each one of these which is, being uniform, it of itself constant the same way, and does it never show any change at all to anything else? The same way it is necessary, said Cebes, for it to be constant, Socrates. But what of the many, such as people or horses or clothes or any such things? Or equality or beauty or all which are named in that way? Then are they constant or in complete opposition to those, neither the same as they nor ever like each other, so to speak, in no way constant? The latter, said Cebes, they are never the same way. Then these you can touch and see and perceive with other senses, but those that are constant are never reached by anything except by the reasoning of the intuition. But are these invisible and not seen? You say the absolute truth, he said. Then do you wish to assume two forms of reality, the visible and the invisible? Let us assume so, he said. And is the invisible always constant, and the visible never constant? Let us assume this also, he said. Well, is there anything else of ours but body and soul? Nothing else, he said. Then to which do we say the body is more similar and related? This is clear to everyone, he said, that it is to the visible. And what of the soul? Is it visible or invisible? Not by humans, Socrates, he said. But we say things are visible and invisible to human nature, or are you thinking of some other? To humans. Then what do we say about the soul? Is it seen or unseen? Not seen. Then is it invisible? Yes. Then the soul is more similar to the invisible than the body, but it to the seen. Necessarily, Socrates. And then what we have been saying for a long time, that the soul, when it makes use of the body, to look at something either through sight or through hearing or through any other sense, for this is through the body, to look at something through the senses. At that time is it dragged by the body into what never is constant, and it wanders and is confused and dizzy like one drunk when touching such things. Certainly. But when it looks by itself, it departs there into the pure and eternal, which is also immortal, and in the same way, and as related to its essence, it is always with that. Whenever it is by itself and is permitted itself, and it has stopped its wandering, and concerning that is always constant in the same way, since it is communing with such. And has this experience of the soul been called wisdom? Absolutely, he said. And you say the truth beautifully, Socrates. Then again, to which does it seem to you, in view of what was said both from before and now, the soul is more similar and related? It seems to me everyone would concede, Socrates, from this method, even the dullest, that the soul is wholly and completely more similar to what is always the same way rather than to what is not. And the body? To the other. Now see it also this way, that when soul and body are in the same thing, nature directs one to serve and be ruled, and the other to rule and be master. And according to this again, which seems to you to be more similar to the divine, and which to the mortal? Or does it not seem to you it is natural for the divine to rule and lead, and for the mortal to be ruled and serve? To me it does. Which then is the soul like? It is clear, Socrates, that the soul is like the divine, and the body like the mortal. Now consider, Cebes, he said. If from all that was said before, it results that the soul is most similar to the divine and immortal and intelligent and uniform and indissoluble, and always the same way being constant in itself, and in turn the body is most like the human and mortal and multiform and unintelligent and dissoluble, and never being constant in itself. Do we have anything else to say on this, dear Cebes? Which has it not thus? We have not. What then? Having it thus, then, is it not fitting for the body to be quickly dissolved, and for the soul to be entirely indissoluble, or nearly so? Of course. Then be aware, he said, that when a person dies, the seen part of him, the body, also lying in the seen, which we call a corpse, which is fit to be dissolved and fall away, does not experience this immediately, but remains for a considerably long time. If someone has died, both having the body in good condition, and especially also in a favorable season, for the body is shrunk and embalmed, as the ones in Egypt are embalmed, it remains almost whole for an incalculable time. And some parts of the body, even if it decays, bones and tendons and all such things, still are, so to speak, immortal. Is it not so? Yes. But the soul then, the invisible, departing to another such place, noble and pure and invisible, into Hades in truth, to the good and wise God, where, if God wills, soon also may my soul go. But is this, which for us has such a nature, being released from the body, immediately dispersed and destroyed, as many people say? Far from it, dear Cebes and Simmias, but it is much more like this, if it departs pure, dragging nothing of the body with it, since it did not join it in life willingly, but avoided it and gathered itself into itself, since it always practiced this. But this is nothing else than correctly loving wisdom, and in reality practicing dying. Or would this not be practicing death? Absolutely. Then being so, does it go away into what is similar to itself, the invisible, divine, and immortal, and wise, where arriving it is ready for itself to be happy, released from wandering and folly and fear, and cruel passion and all other human evils, and as it is said by the initiates, in truth spends the rest of time with the gods. Do we say this, Cebes, or not? This, by Zeus, said Cebes.